There was a time when America did not exist. No United States. No American flag. No Washington. No New York. No borders dividing one country from another. There was only a vast frozen world stretching across a land that would one day become home to one of the most powerful countries on Earth. And somewhere inside that frozen world, thousands of years ago, a small group of hunters was moving through the wilderness. They weren't explorers. They weren't soldiers. They weren't looking for a new continent. They were simply searching for food, following animals, moving through the cold, trying to survive. But without knowing it, these people were walking toward a completely unknown world, a world that would eventually become America.
Good evening. Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world.
And the strangest part, they had absolutely no idea what they were walking into. How did these people reach this unknown land? How did they survive there? How did their descendants spread across an entire continent and build great civilizations? Why did millions of people live in this new world for thousands of years without knowing that another enormous world existed across the ocean? And then, after thousands of years of separation, why did Europeans suddenly become desperate to find it? How did a European sailor searching for China and Japan end up changing the history of the world? And what happened when he finally reached the land he wasn't even looking for? We're going to explain this entire journey in detail. We'll go back to the last ice age, follow the first people into the new world, see how their descendants built powerful civilizations, understand the strange separation between the old world and the new world, and then travel back to 15th century Europe, where war, trade, religion, and ambition were pushing Europeans toward the unknown. And stay with us until the very end. Because there is one part of this story that is genuinely surprising. By the end of this episode, you'll discover what Christopher Columbus promised the Spanish court, why European rulers repeatedly rejected him, why Spain finally agreed to finance his journey, and the extraordinary deception Columbus carried with him when he finally set out across the Atlantic. A deception so serious that the people traveling with him would eventually begin thinking about killing him. So how did all of this begin? Let's go back to the beginning. Long before America had a name, long before Europe knew this continent existed, long before Columbus, there was the Ice Age. Thousands of years ago, the Earth was passing through a period of extreme cold. Massive sheets of ice covered enormous areas of the northern hemisphere. The landscape looked completely different from the world we know today, and because so much of the planet's water was locked inside these giant ice sheets, sea levels had fallen dramatically. As a result, land that is now beneath the sea became exposed. One of the most important areas was between northeastern Asia and North America. Today we know the water separating Siberia from Alaska as the Bering Strait. But during the Ice Age, the geography was very different. A vast region of land existed there. This region is known as Beringia. It was not a narrow road marked on a map. It was a huge landscape of cold, open terrain where animals could move and where human beings could survive. And somewhere in this world, people from Siberia began moving farther and farther into unfamiliar territory. They were hunters. They were following prey. They moved wherever survival required them to move. They did not know that they were entering what would eventually be called the New World. They did not know that the land behind them would become separated from the land ahead of them, and they could not possibly have known that their descendants would remain in this world for thousands of years. But they stayed. They spread. They adapted. Generation after generation moved farther across the continent. They followed rivers. They crossed forests. They entered grasslands. They lived near mountains, deserts, and coastlines. And slowly, something remarkable happened. The people who had entered this new land began developing civilizations of their own. Entire societies emerged. Different languages developed. Different traditions appeared. Different political systems took shape. Different communities began creating their own worlds. Thousands of years passed, and the Americas became home to millions of people. In what is now Mexico, a great empire eventually emerged, the Aztec Empire. At its height, the empire controlled an enormous region. It included hundreds of states and communities, with millions of people living within its sphere of influence. South of the Aztec world was another civilization whose roots stretched back thousands of years, the Maya. The Maya became famous for their achievements in architecture, mathematics, astronomy, writing, art, and culture. Their civilization had existed for centuries before Europeans arrived, and farther south, across the Andes, another great civilization emerged, the Inca Empire. Its territory stretched across parts of modern-day Ecuador, Peru, Chile, and Argentina. Its population reached into the millions. Its political system connected vast territories separated by mountains and difficult terrain. But the Americas were not home to only 3 great civilizations. There were countless other societies spread across the continent. In the islands of the West Indies, the Arawak peoples lived in established communities. Across North America, Native American nations occupied enormous territories. Some lived in villages, some lived in larger settlements, some depended heavily on agriculture. Others relied on hunting, fishing, and gathering. Many cultivated maize on a large scale. Different societies had different languages, beliefs, traditions, and political structures. Millions of people were living across the Americas. And yet, something extraordinary separated them from the old world. They did not know each other. At the same time that millions of people lived in the Americas, millions more were living in Europe, Asia, and Africa. But for thousands of years, these two worlds were almost completely separated. The people of Europe did not know what was happening in the Americas, and the people of the Americas did not know what was happening in Europe. For them, the other world was almost impossible to imagine. There were no regular ships crossing the Atlantic. No shared maps, no established trade route, no continuous communication. The connection had been broken thousands of years earlier, and yet over the centuries, stories began to appear. Stories of people who may have reached distant lands across the oceans. One of the most interesting examples comes from China. Ancient Chinese writings mention a mysterious distant land called Fusang. Some have suggested that Fusang may have referred to a place somewhere in the Americas. There is also the story of a Buddhist monk known as Hui Shen. According to later accounts, he traveled eastward from China with several companions and eventually returned after spending decades in a distant foreign land. He described this land as Fusang. Whether Fusang was actually America remains disputed. But the story is fascinating because it raises an obvious question. Could people from the old world have reached the Americas before Columbus? There were other claims too. Centuries later, Viking explorers from northern Europe definitely reached North America. Norse settlements existed in Newfoundland, in what is now Canada. The remains of those settlements still exist. And then there are other claims. Some have suggested that Muslim sailors may have reached America before Columbus. Others have suggested connections involving people from India. There are stories, theories, and interpretations. But there is an important distinction. Even if some of these earlier journeys happened, none of them created the permanent connection between the Old World and the New World that would eventually transform global history. The two worlds remained largely separate. Europe did not suddenly become aware of America. America did not suddenly become connected to Europe. The separation continued until the 15th century. The 15th century changed everything, and the reason had very little to do with America itself. Europe was going through enormous political, economic, and religious changes. For centuries, Europe had depended on trade with Asia. Markets in the East were associated with incredible wealth: silk, spices, precious stones, gold, silver, luxury goods. European merchants wanted access to these markets. European rulers wanted the wealth, and European kingdoms wanted a way to reach Asia that they could control. Then, in 1453, one of the most important cities in the history of Europe fell: Constantinople. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II conquered the city. The Byzantine Empire, the final political continuation of the Roman Empire in the East, came to an end. For Europe, this was a military and religious shock. Constantinople was an important Christian city. It was also positioned at one of the most important crossroads between Europe and Asia. Trade passing from the east toward Europe had long moved through networks connected to this region. But now the political balance had changed. European powers began looking for alternatives. They needed new routes. They wanted direct access to Asia. And there was another problem. Europe was struggling economically. Poverty was widespread. Food insecurity affected ordinary people. Trade was difficult, and the wealth described in stories about Asia seemed almost irresistible. European society had heard stories about China and Japan. One of the most influential sources was the travel account of Marco Polo. Marco Polo had traveled through Asia and described the enormous wealth of the East. In European imagination, China became a place of incredible riches. It was known as Cathay. Japan was known as Cipangu. And the stories about these lands became increasingly attractive to Europeans, especially at a time when Europe itself was struggling. Marco Polo described wealth on a scale that seemed almost unbelievable. Gold, luxury, rich rulers, magnificent palaces, a world that appeared to possess resources Europe desperately wanted, and this created a powerful dream. If Europeans could reach Asia, they could reach that wealth. But there was a problem. How? The traditional land routes were complicated. The Mediterranean routes were controlled by powerful Muslim states and rival political powers. And traveling around Africa was possible, but extremely long and dangerous. European sailors needed another route, a shorter route, a safer route. And then a relatively unknown Italian sailor appeared with an extraordinary idea. His name was Christopher Columbus. Columbus believed that he had discovered the shortest possible route to Asia. He believed that if he sailed west across the Atlantic, he would eventually reach Japan. And from Japan, he could reach China and the rest of Asia. His idea depended on one major assumption: that the Earth was much smaller than it actually was. Columbus knew the Earth was round, but his calculations underestimated the size of the planet and the distance between Europe and Asia. To him, the western route looked possible, and if he was right, the rewards could be enormous. Columbus did not only dream about wealth, he wanted fame. He wanted political power. He wanted to control the territories he discovered. And he also saw his journey as a religious mission. He believed the lands he found could be brought under Christian rule. He imagined wealth flowing back to Europe. He imagined Christianity expanding into Asia. And he imagined himself at the center of it all. But there was one problem. Nobody wanted to finance him. Columbus began going from court to court. He first presented his idea in Portugal. He tried to convince the Portuguese court. They rejected him. He continued looking for support. He approached other European powers. Again, he was rejected. He went from one place to another, trying to convince rulers that his plan could change their fortunes. But no one wanted to risk money on a voyage based on calculations many experts considered unrealistic. Columbus remained determined. Then, in 1485, he arrived in Spain. At the time, Spain was ruled by Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella. But Spain had other priorities. The kingdom was still fighting the Muslim kingdom of Granada. For years, Spanish forces had been trying to conquer Granada. And while the king and queen were focused on war, Columbus waited. He continued trying to get an audience. He presented his plan again and again, but there was no immediate answer. Then the situation began changing. By 1491, Granada was close to defeat. The final Muslim stronghold in Iberia was collapsing. And suddenly, Columbus had an opportunity. He was finally able to present his proposal directly to the Spanish monarchs. His argument was powerful. He told them that the route he planned to take could lead to Asia. He promised access to immense wealth. He talked about gold. He talked about trade. He talked about new territories. And he also spoke about Christianity. The lands he expected to reach, he argued, could become places where Spanish influence and Christianity would expand. For Ferdinand and Isabella, this was an attractive combination. Wealth, trade, territory, religion, and perhaps, most importantly, a chance to compete with other European powers. Finally, Spain agreed. Queen Isabella approved the expedition. Columbus had spent years trying to convince European rulers. Now he finally had what he wanted: ships, money, a crew, and royal backing. The voyage was about to begin. 3 ships were prepared: the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Their mission was supposed to be simple: sail west, reach Asia, find Japan, reach China, return with wealth. But there was something Columbus wasn't telling the people who were about to sail with him. Something that could put the entire expedition in danger. Something that could destroy the confidence of his own crew. Because Columbus had a problem. His calculations were wrong. He believed Asia was much closer than it really was. And he knew that if his sailors understood the true distance they were traveling, they might refuse to continue. So Columbus began doing something extraordinary. He kept 2 sets of information. One record was for himself, another was for his crew. The sailors were told they had traveled a shorter distance than they had actually traveled. Columbus was hiding the truth. He wanted them to believe they were still close to their destination, but the ocean kept stretching ahead of them. Day after day, nothing but water, no Asia, no Japan, no China. And the crew began to realize something was wrong. They had left the familiar world behind. They were deep in the Atlantic, and the man leading them was not telling them the full truth. Fear began spreading among the sailors. What if Columbus was wrong? What if there was no Asia? What if they never found land? What if they had sailed so far west that they could never return? The expedition was becoming a gamble with their lives, and eventually some of the sailors began discussing something even more dangerous. They wanted Columbus dead. The same man who had spent years convincing kings and queens to finance his dream was now struggling to convince his own crew that he had not led them to their deaths. But Columbus had one more problem. He had made promises to his crew, promises about what they would receive if the expedition succeeded, promises about wealth, rewards, and recognition. And when the journey became more dangerous than expected, those promises became another source of tension. So what exactly did Columbus promise them? How did he convince the crew to keep sailing? How close did the expedition really come to mutiny? And how long could Columbus continue hiding the truth? Because the man who had convinced Spain that he knew exactly where he was going was now sailing into a world he had never seen. And the strangest part of all? Columbus still believed he was heading toward Asia. He had no idea that the land he was searching for was not China, not Japan, not the rich kingdoms described by Marco Polo. Something else was waiting beyond the Atlantic, something that would completely change the history of the world. And when that land finally appeared, Columbus would make another mistake. A mistake so enormous that its consequences would continue for centuries. But before we reach that moment, we need to understand exactly what was happening on those ships. Because the story of America's European beginning is not simply the story of a brave explorer sailing into the unknown. It is also the story of a man who underestimated the world, miscalculated the distance, hid the truth from his crew, and continued forward even when the people around him were beginning to lose faith. So what happened next? How did Columbus keep control of the expedition? What did he tell his sailors when they demanded answers? And when land finally appeared on the horizon, what did he actually think he had discovered? The answer would change the history of two worlds forever. And that is where our next chapter begins.